Von Braun returned to his chair, the book open in his lap. Ford understood that an automobile available only to wealthy enthusiasts was merely a curiosity. An automobile that ordinary workers could purchase transformed society. He didn't invent the automobile or even the assembly line. But he understood how to integrate design and manufacturing so that technical possibility became social reality. The parallel to rocketry was clear. Von Braun had witnessed the V-2 program produce approximately 6,000 missiles over 3 years at enormous cost in resources and human life, achieving spectacular individual successes, but insufficient numbers to affect the war's outcome. By contrast, the Apollo program had launched 32 Saturn rockets in less than a decade, achieving a lunar landing and numerous other objectives through sustained operational capability, rather than occasional demonstrations. The most important lesson I learned in America, von Braun continued, was that innovation is not complete when you solve a technical problem. Innovation is complete only when you've created a system that can produce solutions reliably, affordably, and at the scale necessary to meet society's needs. This requires thinking about manufacturing, supply chains, worker training, quality control, and maintenance from the very beginning of the design process, not as an afterthought once the technical design is complete. This perspective had shaped von Braun's leadership of the Marshall Space Flight Center and his approach to the Saturn program. He had insisted that manufacturing contractors be involved in design reviews, that engineers visit production facilities regularly, the cost and schedule be considered alongside performance in evaluating design options. These practices, commonplace in American industry but novel in aerospace, had enabled the rapid development and deployment of the Saturn family of rockets. The student asked about the Soviet space program, which had achieved numerous first satellite, first human in space, first spacewalk, before falling behind America in the moon race. Did the Soviets fail because they lacked American industrial capability? Von Braun shook his head. The Soviet Union possessed enormous industrial capacity and highly capable engineers. Their failure, if we can call it that, stemmed from different causes. Soviet industry was organized around central planning and isolated design bureaus competing for resources. This created brilliance in individual programs, but poor coordination across the industrial system. Sergei Korolev, their chief designer, was a genius comparable to anyone in the American program, but he worked within constraints that prevented him from leveraging Soviet industrial capacity as effectively as we leveraged American industry. He paused, choosing his next words carefully. There is also the moral dimension we cannot ignore. Soviet industry relied heavily on coerced labor, as did German industry under the Nazis. I participated in that system, to my eternal shame. American industry, while imperfect and certainly not free of injustice, operated fundamentally on voluntary labor and market mechanisms. Workers manufactured rockets because they were paid wages sufficient to support families and build lives. This created a different relationship between workers and their work, one that fostered quality and continuous improvement in ways that coerced labor never could. The conversation turned to the future of space exploration, a topic von Braun had been contemplating in his retirement. He believed that the next phase would require even greater emphasis on reducing costs through improved manufacturing efficiency. The Apollo program demonstrated that humans can travel to the moon, but it did so at a cost that cannot be sustained indefinitely. Each Saturn V launch cost approximately $400 million in current terms. This is acceptable for a limited program of national importance, but prohibitive for routine space operations. Von Braun envisioned a future where space access would become sufficiently affordable that commercial activities could flourish beyond Earth's atmosphere. Just as aviation progressed from expensive barnstorming demonstrations to routine commercial transportation, space travel must follow a similar path. This will require innovations not primarily in rocket technology we largely understand. How to build rockets, but in manufacturing processes that reduce costs while maintaining reliability. He pointed to emerging technologies that might enable this transformation. Automated manufacturing, computer-aided design, new materials that are easier to work with, modular designs that allow components to be produced by multiple suppliers and assembled flexibly. These are the innovations that will make space truly accessible. The technical knowledge to reach orbit exists today. The challenge is making that knowledge actionable at costs that allow frequent flights serving diverse purposes. This vision would largely prove accurate. In the decades following von Braun's death in June 1977, space access costs gradually declined as manufacturing techniques improved and competition among providers increased. The Space Shuttle program, though flawed in many respects, demonstrated that reusable spacecraft could reduce per-flight costs compared to expendable rockets. Commercial satellite launches became routine business. By the early 21st century, private companies like SpaceX would revolutionize space access by applying manufacturing innovations that von Braun had advocated: vertical integration, rapid iteration, design for manufacturability, achieving cost reductions that made his Apollo-era predictions seem conservative. The student's final question addressed von Braun's legacy. Dr. von Braun, how do you wish to be remembered? Von Braun considered the question in silence for a long moment. His life had been extraordinary and morally complex. He had created weapons that killed thousands. Yet he had also enabled humanity's first steps toward becoming a spacefaring civilization. He had served a monstrous regime, yet he had contributed significantly to the defense and technological advancement of a democratic nation. He had dreamed of space exploration from childhood and had lived to see those dreams realized, though not without compromises that haunted him. I hope to be remembered as someone who learned, he finally replied. When I came to America, I thought I knew everything important about rockets. I was wrong. America taught me that technical knowledge, without understanding of how to translate that knowledge into practical systems, is incomplete. I learned humility about the limits of pure technical approach and appreciation for the wisdom embedded in American industrial practices. He gestured again toward the Apollo photograph. That rocket represents not individual genius but collective achievement. Thousands of workers manufactured its components. Hundreds of engineers designed its systems. Dozens of managers coordinated the entire effort. My contribution was real, but was only meaningful because it was part of a larger system that could translate ideas into operational hardware. I hope to be remembered as someone who understood this truth and worked to help others understand it as well. The interview concluded, and von Braun walked the student to the door, shaking hands warmly. As he returned to his study, he paused at the window, looking up at the afternoon sky. Somewhere up there, Voyager 1 and 2 were speeding toward the outer solar system, carrying messages from Earth to whatever might find them in the distant future. Those spacecraft had been built by the same American industrial system that had produced the Saturn V, demonstrating again that sustained space exploration required not just scientific vision, but manufacturing capability to realize that vision. In his final months, von Braun would write and speak about the importance of manufacturing innovation for future space exploration, emphasizing themes he had developed over 3 decades in America. He had arrived in 1945 as a German rocket scientist who understood propulsion and guidance, but was ignorant of production systems. He left life in 1977 as an American space pioneer who had learned that true innovation required integrating technical excellence with manufacturing capability, that the greatest achievements emerged not from individual brilliance alone, but from industrial systems that could transform ideas into reality at the scale necessary to change the world. The lesson of Wernher von Braun's amazement at American mass production was ultimately a lesson about the nature of innovation itself. Technical knowledge and scientific understanding are necessary but insufficient for progress. True advancement requires the ability to translate knowledge into products, to manufacture those products reliably, and to scale production to meet societal needs. Von Braun had witnessed this truth demonstrated definitively during World War II, had spent decades implementing it in American rocket programs, and had seen it vindicated when humans walked on the moon using rockets that were as much triumphs of industrial organization as they were of engineering brilliance. As the sun set over Alexandria that evening in August 1977, Wernher von Braun sat in his study one final time before fatigue forced him to rest. Contemplating a life that had spanned from the horse-drawn wagons of his Prussian childhood to the rocket-powered spacecraft exploring the solar system, the journey had taught him that humanity's reach into space depended less on individual genius than on collective capability, less on theoretical knowledge than on practical systems, less on brilliant prototypes than on reliable production. These lessons, learned through decades of observation and participation in American industrial culture, represented his most important contribution to the space age, understanding that opening the frontier of space required not just dreamers who could imagine what was possible, but builders who could make those possibilities real, again and again, as many times as necessary to turn dreams into enduring reality. Hans looked at the photograph for a long time, something shifting in his expression. When he looked back at Mitchell, tears were running silently down his cheeks, though he made no sound. Mitchell did something that broke every rule in the manual. He reached out and pulled the boy into an embrace. Hans stiffened initially, then collapsed against Mitchell's chest, his thin body shaking with silent sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and bottomless. Private Chen looked away, suddenly finding the ceiling intensely interesting. In the corner, other soldiers who had witnessed the scene busied themselves with their equipment, understanding without words that something significant had just occurred. Something that had nothing to do with armies and conquest and everything to do with the stubborn persistence of humanity. The American advance continued, and Mitchell's unit moved eastward with Hans in tow, the boy becoming an increasingly familiar presence among the soldiers. The first week was the hardest. Hans spoke almost no English, beyond a few words picked up from propaganda leaflets, and most of the Americans spoke no German beyond crude phrases. Communication happened through gestures, drawings in the dirt, and the slow, patient repetition that characterized language learning under pressure. Private Chen, whose parents had immigrated from Guangdong province to San Francisco's Chinatown, took a particular interest in Hans. Chen himself had experienced prejudice in America. His family interned briefly at the war's start before his enlistment proved his loyalty. He saw in Hans another outsider trying to navigate a hostile world, and he shared his rations with a generosity that often left himself hungry. "Kid needs to eat," Chen would say when Mitchell questioned his sacrifice. "Look at him, all bones and eyes." My ma would have a fit seeing a child this skinny, indeed. Hans was severely malnourished, his ribs visible beneath pale skin and his cheeks hollow. The army doctors who examined him estimated he had lost nearly 30% of his body weight, surviving on bread crusts and potato peelings during the war's final months. Under the Americans' care, he began to recover, though the psychological wounds would take far longer to heal. Hans was assigned light duties, carrying water, sorting supplies, anything that kept him occupied and useful. Mitchell recognized the therapeutic value of routine and purpose, having seen it work with traumatized soldiers. The boy threw himself into tasks with almost desperate intensity, as if proving his worth would guarantee his continued safety. He watched Mitchell constantly, studying the sergeant's mannerisms, learning to anticipate his needs, positioning himself always within the older man's line of sight. "He's attached to you something fierce," observed Corporal Hayes one evening, as they set up camp in a requisitioned farmhouse. "Follows you like a duckling," Mitchell had noticed. Hans's dependence was both touching and concerning. The behavior of a child who had lost everything and now clung to the first source of stability he had encountered. Mitchell found himself thinking increasingly of his daughter Sarah, wondering how she would respond to having a brother. The thought was premature, perhaps even foolish, but it had lodged in his mind and refused to leave. The American soldiers' attitudes toward Hans varied widely. Some, like Chen and Hayes, treated him with rough kindness, teaching him English phrases and sharing jokes he didn't quite understand but laughed at anyway. Others maintained cold distance, unable to forget that this boy represented an enemy that had killed their friends. A few were openly hostile, muttering that the kid should be in a POW cage, not eating their food and sleeping in their camps. The tension came to a head in early May 1945, just days after Germany's unconditional surrender. The war in Europe was officially over, but the emotional aftermath was just beginning. Private Roger Sullivan, a temperamental Bostonian who had lost his brother at the Battle of the Bulge, cornered Hans while Mitchell was away meeting with command. "You think you're one of us now?" Sullivan spat, his face inches from Hans's. The boy pressed himself against a wall, unable to understand the words, but reading the hatred in Sullivan's expression perfectly. "Your people killed my brother. 1919, 'cause of Nazi bastards like you." Hans tried to flee, but Sullivan grabbed his arm roughly. Other soldiers began to gather, some stepping forward to intervene. Others watching with neutral expressions that suggested they weren't entirely unsympathetic to Sullivan's rage. The situation was escalating rapidly when Mitchell's voice cut through the tension like a whip crack. "Sullivan, stand down. Now." The command voice of a staff sergeant carried authority accumulated through 3 years of combat leadership. Sullivan released Hans but didn't step back, his jaw clenched and his eyes burning. "He doesn't belong here, Sarge. He's German. He's a child who was forced into a uniform he didn't choose, fighting for a regime he didn't understand," Mitchell interrupted, his voice steel-wrapped in ice. "Your brother's death was a tragedy. But punishing this boy won't bring Tommy back, and it sure as hell won't honor his memory." According to research documented in the book After the Reich by historian Giles MacDonough, the immediate post-war period was marked by significant tensions between occupying forces and the German civilian population, particularly regarding children who had been militarized by the Nazi regime. Many American soldiers struggled to reconcile their sympathy for children with their anger at German atrocities, creating complex emotional dynamics within occupation units. The confrontation ended without violence, but it left scars. Hans, who had begun to relax around the Americans, retreated back into fearful silence. Mitchell found him that evening sitting alone behind the supply tent, hugging his knees and rocking slightly. When Mitchell approached, Hans looked up with an expression that broke the sergeant's heart, resignation mixed with the terrible acceptance of someone who expected betrayal. Mitchell sat down beside him, not speaking at first. They remained that way as the sun set. Two people from different worlds, sitting in the ruins of a civilization that had consumed itself through hatred. Finally, Mitchell began to talk, speaking in English he knew Hans couldn't fully understand, but hoping the tone would convey meaning. "I'm not going to let anyone hurt you," Mitchell said. "I don't care what uniform you wore or what language you speak. You're under my protection now, and I take that seriously. When this is all sorted out, when the paperwork is filed and the bureaucrats make their decisions, I'm going to try to bring you home with me, to Iowa, to meet Sarah and Eleanor." June 1945 brought the beginning of a new reality. Germany lay in ruins, divided into occupation zones administered by the victorious Allies. Aschaffenburg fell within the American zone. The town slowly began to resemble something functional again, as military government personnel established order amid the chaos. For Hans Friedrich Weber, this meant confronting a labyrinth of bureaucracy that would determine his fate. Mitchell had been careful to document everything: Hans's surrender, his subsequent cooperation, his age and orphan status. The sergeant spent evenings hunched over forms in triplicate, writing careful explanations in the precise language demanded by Army regulations, consulted with military legal officers, chaplains, and anyone else who might navigate the complex process of bringing a former enemy child to America. The challenges were substantial. American immigration law in 1945 was restrictive, particularly regarding Germans. The Displaced Persons Act, which would eventually allow thousands of European refugees into the United States, had not yet been passed. Existing regulations regarding adoption of foreign children were vague at best, designed for friendly nations rather than defeated enemies. Mitchell was attempting something that existed in a legal gray zone, neither explicitly permitted nor explicitly forbidden. Captain Edwards, who had softened somewhat toward Hans over the weeks, connected Mitchell with Lieutenant Colonel Frank Morrison, a judge advocate general officer stationed in Frankfurt. Morrison was a Philadelphia lawyer in civilian life, a man who understood both the letter and spirit of law. He listened to Mitchell's request with the careful attention of someone calculating odds. "What you're proposing is complicated, Sergeant," Morrison said, reviewing the documents Mitchell had brought. They met in a requisitioned office that still smelled of plaster dust and defeat. "The boy has no living relatives." "None that we can locate, sir. His father was killed on the Eastern Front. Mother died in the bombing of Frankfurt in October 1944. We've checked with the Red Cross and local authorities, no aunts, uncles, or grandparents. He's alone." Morrison tapped his pen against the desk thoughtfully. "The precedent is unclear. We've had cases of American servicemen marrying German women. Those at least have a legal framework. But adoption of an enemy national by a serving soldier? That's unprecedented, sir. The war is over," Mitchell said carefully. "He's not an enemy anymore, just a boy who needs a home." The legal officer's expression suggested he appreciated the sentiment even as he grappled with the reality. "The immigration quotas are extremely restrictive. German nationals are particularly limited. Even with your sponsorship, it could take years and there's no guarantee of approval. Historical documentation from the American military government of Germany shows that in the immediate post-war period, American soldiers submitted hundreds of petitions to bring German children to the United States, with success rates varying wildly depending on individual circumstances. The persistence of the servicemen, and often pure chance in terms of which officials reviewed each case. Mitchell refused to be discouraged. He wrote letters to his congressman, Representative Thomas Martin of Iowa's 1st District, explaining Hans's situation and requesting intervention. He contacted private adoption agencies seeking any possible pathway. He even reached out to his local newspaper, the Cedar Rapids Gazette, which ran a human interest story about the Iowa sergeant trying to bring home an orphaned German boy. The article generated surprising support, with letters pouring in from Iowans offering donations for legal fees or vouching for Mitchell's character. Meanwhile, Hans remained in legal limbo. Categorized as a displaced person under American military custody, he continued living with Mitchell's unit, which had been reassigned to occupation duties in the Frankfurt area. The boy's English improved rapidly through immersion, his young brain absorbing the new language with impressive speed. By midsummer, he could hold basic conversations, though his vocabulary remained limited and his accent thick. "Sergeant Mitchell is my friend," Hans said haltingly one afternoon, practicing English with Private Chen. "He is a good man. I wanted ... to go with him. To America." Chen corrected his grammar gently. "You want to say I want to go with him to America? And yes, kid, he's trying to make that happen. Mitchell doesn't give up easily." What Hans didn't understand, and what Mitchell struggled to explain, was that wanting something wasn't enough when confronting governmental bureaucracy. Each day brought new forms, new requirements, new obstacles. Hans needed a birth certificate, lost in the bombing of Frankfurt City Hall, needed documentation of his parents' deaths difficult to obtain when records offices had been destroyed. He needed medical examinations, background checks, and statements from multiple witnesses attesting to his character and Mitchell's suitability as a guardian. The process consumed Mitchell emotionally and financially. Army sergeant's pay was modest, and legal fees mounted quickly. Mitchell sent letters home to Eleanor explaining the situation, assuring her they could afford this, that it was important. Eleanor's responses were supportive but practical, noting their own daughter's needs and the financial realities of raising 2 children on a soldier's income. She never said no, but Mitchell could read concern between the lines. In August 1945, nearly 4 months after Hans's surrender, Lieutenant Colonel Morrison called Mitchell to Frankfurt for a meeting. The legal officer's expression was carefully neutral as Mitchell entered, Hans waiting nervously outside. "I've found a possible pathway," Morrison said without preamble. "It's not adoption that remains too complicated legally, but I can classify Hans as a war orphan under your temporary guardianship, with a special visa category that would allow him to enter the United States as a dependent minor. Once in America, you could pursue formal adoption through civilian courts, which would be significantly easier than navigating military bureaucracy from here." Mitchell felt hope surge. What do we need to do? Considerable paperwork, multiple approvals from various offices, and quite frankly, some luck. The regulations I'm invoking are ambiguous enough that a different legal officer might interpret them differently. We'll need approval from the theater commander, endorsements from your chain of command, and clearance from State Department officials. It could work, Sergeant. Or it could fall apart at any stage. Mitchell straightened. "Tell me what to do, sir. Whatever it takes." September 1945 brought the first genuine chill of autumn to Frankfurt. And with it, the reality that Mitchell's deployment would eventually end. American forces were drawing down, sending soldiers home in waves based on a point system that calculated length of service, combat decorations, and time overseas. Mitchell had enough points to qualify for discharge by year's end, which meant his window to resolve Hans's status was closing rapidly. Eleanor Mitchell received her husband's letters in Cedar Rapids with mixed feelings that she struggled to articulate even to herself. The woman who had married Robert Mitchell 7 years earlier had been carefree and optimistic, a schoolteacher with dreams of a quiet life, raising children and tending a garden. The war had aged her beyond her 29 years, turning her into someone who listened to radio broadcasts with clenched fists and read casualty lists with dread. Now Robert was safe, the European war over. Pacific War ended with Japan's surrender in August. But he was asking something unprecedented. Eleanor reread his most recent letter, dated September 7th, trying to understand the man her husband had become through 3 years of combat. "Dearest Eleanor," the letter began in Robert's careful handwriting. "I know what I'm asking is difficult. I know bringing Hans home will change our lives in ways we can't fully anticipate. but I've thought about this constantly, prayed about it, examined it from every angle, and I keep reaching the same conclusion. This is what we're meant to do. The letter continued for 4 pages, describing Hans in detail his nightmares that woke the camp most nights. His careful way of eating as if each meal might be his last, his fierce loyalty and desperate need for stability. Robert wrote about watching Hans interact with other displaced children, how he would share his food even when hungry, how he tried to comfort younger kids who cried for lost parents. He reminds me of Sarah, Robert wrote, and this line made Eleanor pause. Not in appearance Hans is fair, where Sarah is dark, thin where she's sturdy but in spirit. He has that same fundamental goodness, that sense of right and wrong that no amount of propaganda or hardship has destroyed. The Nazis tried to make him into something terrible, Eleanor, but they failed. Underneath the Hitler Youth uniform was just a scared boy who wanted his mother. Eleanor sat at their kitchen table. Afternoon sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked fields turning golden with harvest. Sarah played in the yard with their neighbor's dog, her laughter carrying clearly through the open window. Their life was peaceful now, orderly and predictable in ways that had seemed impossible during the war's darkest days. Bringing a traumatized German boy into that peace felt dangerous, like inviting chaos into carefully constructed sanctuary. Yet Eleanor trusted Robert's judgment. She had married him partly for his moral clarity, his ability to see situations with unusual insight. If he believed this boy needed them, and they needed this boy, perhaps he was right. She picked up her pen and began drafting a response, choosing words carefully. Dearest Robert, your letters about Hans have moved me deeply. I won't pretend I'm not frightened by what you're proposing. Our life here is settled, and Sarah is thriving in school. Bringing in a child who has lived through such trauma, who speaks another language and comes from such a different world, I worry about Sarah, about whether we can provide what Hans needs, about whether we're equipped for this challenge. But I'm also reminded of the sermon Reverend Thompson gave last Sunday. He spoke about the parable of the Good Samaritan, about how mercy means inconveniencing ourselves for strangers in need. I thought of you when he said that, Robert. I thought about what you must be seeing over there, the devastation and the children caught in it through no fault of their own. So yes, bring Hans home. We'll figure it out together as we've figured out everything else. I'll prepare Sarah, explain that she's going to have a brother. I'll set up the spare room. I'll learn what I can about helping traumatized children. I'll trust that God and love are enough, because they'll have to be. Eleanor sealed the letter and walked it to the post office that same afternoon, before doubt could undermine her resolve. The postal clerk, Mrs. Henderson, an elderly woman whose son had died at Guadalcanal, noticed the address. Still writing to Germany? Mrs. Henderson asked, not unkindly. My husband is coming home soon, Eleanor replied. And he's bringing someone with him. She didn't elaborate, and Mrs. Henderson didn't press. In those early post-war months, everyone in Cedar Rapids had their own complicated relationships with victory. Joy at the war's end, mixed with grief for the lost, relief for the returned, mixed with uncertainty about the future. The war had changed everyone, reshaping lives and expectations in ways both obvious and subtle. According to historical records from the National Archives, approximately 5,000 German war orphans were brought to the United States between 1945 and 1950 through various means: formal adoptions, informal guardianships, sponsorships by religious organizations, and individual military petitions. Each case represented a story of connection across enemy lines, of Americans choosing to see humanity rather than nationality in children who had lost everything. When Eleanor's letter reached Robert 3 weeks later, he read it twice before showing it to Hans. The boy had learned enough English now to comprehend most of what it said. Though Robert translated the difficult parts into the simple German he had picked up, when Hans understood that Eleanor had agreed that there was a woman in Iowa preparing a room for him, his reaction was complex, hope warring with fear, gratitude mixed with unworthiness. She will ... she will like me, Hans asked, his English still uncertain, but improving daily. She'll love you, Robert corrected gently. Just give her time. Change is hard for everyone, Hans. But my wife has a good heart. She understands what you've been through. Hans nodded slowly, processing this information with the careful consideration he applied to everything. That evening, he asked Private Chen for help writing his own letter to Eleanor, laboriously composing sentences in English with Chen's patient corrections. The letter was simple, its grammar imperfect, but its sincerity unmistakable. Dear Mrs. Mitchell, my name is Hans. I am 12 years old. Sergeant Mitchell has been very kind to me. He saved my life. I will try to be good son for you and good brother for Sarah. I will learn English better. I will work hard. Thank you for letting me come to your home. With respect, Hans Weber. Robert enclosed Hans's letter with his next correspondence to Eleanor. Along with a photograph, Private Chen had taken Robert and Hans standing together outside the requisition building that served as their barracks, the boy looking small beside the sergeant, but smiling tentatively at the camera. It was the first time anyone had seen Hans smile since his surrender, and the significance wasn't lost on anyone who witnessed it. November 1945 brought Mitchell's discharge papers and finally approval for Hans to travel to the United States under emergency refugee provisions. The bureaucratic miracle had required intervention from multiple officials, including a personal review by the theater commander. But Lieutenant Colonel Morrison's creative interpretation of regulations had prevailed. Hans Weber was classified as a displaced minor in military custody with special immigration status pending civilian adoption proceedings, a category that might have been invented specifically for him. The journey home began on November 23rd with a train from Frankfurt to Bremerhaven, the North Seaport city that served as a primary embarkation point for American forces returning home. Hans had never seen the ocean, and his first glimpse of the massive gray Atlantic left him speechless. The troop ship USS General W.G. Hahn, a converted passenger vessel, loomed impossibly large against the dock, its hull painted military gray, and its decks crowded with soldiers eager to return to lives interrupted by war. Hans stayed close to Mitchell during the boarding process, overwhelmed by the chaos of thousands of men streaming up gangways, their duffel bags and equipment creating a river of olive drab. Several soldiers noticed the boy his civilian clothes, marking him as an anomaly among the uniformed troops. But Mitchell's protective presence discouraged questions. They had been assigned a small cabin on D-deck, cramped quarters with bunk beds and minimal amenities, but to Hans, it represented luxury compared to the shelters and ruins he had known for the past year. The Atlantic crossing took 9 days, and Hans spent most of them seasick. The ship rolled continuously in November seas, and the boy huddled in his bunk, miserable and green-faced, while Mitchell tried to coax him to eat saltines and sip water. Other soldiers showed unexpected kindness, offering remedies ranging from the practical to the bizarre ginger candies, acupressure wristbands, even a concoction of brandy and lemon juice that smelled terrible and worked about as well as could be expected, which is to say, not at all. First time at sea is always the worst, observed Captain Edwards, who stopped by their cabin on the 3rd day. The officer had warmed considerably to Hans over the months, his initial hostility replaced by something approaching avuncular concern. I spent my entire first Atlantic crossing feeding the fish. Character-building experience, or so they tell me. Hans managed a weak smile at this, understanding enough English now to catch the humor. His language skills had progressed remarkably, immersion combined with a child's neuroplasticity producing rapid results. He still struggled with idioms and complex grammar, but he could hold basic conversations and understand most of what was said to him. On the 5th day, the seas calmed enough for Hans to venture onto the deck. Mitchell took him topside, where they stood at the rail watching dolphins race alongside the ship. The animals moved with effortless grace through the dark water, occasionally leaping in arcs that caught the weak November sunlight. Hans watched in wonder, having never imagined such creatures existed outside of books. America has so many animals, Hans said, his English carrying a thick German accent that would never entirely disappear. Dolphins and ... and what else? Deer, rabbits, squirrels, Mitchell listed. Iowa has lots of farmland, so horses and cattle and pigs. We have a dog named Buddy Well. Technically he belongs to our neighbor, but he spends half his time at our house. Sarah spoils him with table scraps. Hans absorbed this information carefully, building a mental picture of his future home. Sarah, ... she will not mind me. She will not be angry. I am coming. Mitchell had worried about this question, knowing that Sarah's reaction would significantly impact Hans's adjustment. I've written to her, explaining everything. She's excited to have a brother. She's been asking her mother when you'll arrive. This wasn't entirely accurate. Eleanor's latest letter had indicated that Sarah's feelings were complicated, a mixture of curiosity and territorial anxiety about sharing her parents. But Mitchell saw no benefit in burdening Hans with those nuances. The boy carried enough uncertainty without adding more. According to records from the United States Immigration and Naturalization Service, the immediate post-war period saw approximately 15,000 refugees and displaced persons arrive at American ports monthly during late 1945, though the vast majority were adults or families traveling together. Unaccompanied minors like Hans remain statistical anomalies, their cases processed with additional scrutiny. The ship made landfall at New York Harbor on December 2, 1945, slipping past the Statue of Liberty in early morning mist. Hans stood at the rail beside Mitchell, watching the Manhattan skyline emerge from the fog like something from a dream. The buildings seemed impossibly tall, clusters of stone and steel reaching toward a gray sky. Hans had seen photographs of American cities and propaganda materials that portrayed them as soulless industrial wastelands. But the reality was far more complex, intimidating certainly, but also magnificent in scale and ambition. Processing through immigration took hours. They waited in long lines at Ellis Island, surrounded by other arrivals speaking dozens of languages, survivors of concentration camps, displaced families, refugees from across Europe. An immigration officer reviewed Hans's paperwork with skeptical thoroughness, questioning Mitchell repeatedly about their relationship and his intentions. "You understand this child is not yet legally your son?" the officer said, a middle-aged man with tired eyes who had processed thousands of similar cases. "The special visa allows him entry, but formal adoption must be completed through Iowa state courts. It could take months, possibly a year." "I understand, sir," Mitchell replied. "I have legal representation waiting in Cedar Rapids. We'll begin the process immediately." The officer stamped Hans's documents with decisive finality. "Welcome to the United States, son. This is your chance at a new life. Make the most of it." Hans nodded solemnly, not entirely understanding the significance, but recognizing the gravity in the man's tone. They collected their bags and emerged into the cacophony of New York automobile horns. Shouting vendors, the rumble of elevated trains, thousands of people moving with purposeful urgency. Hans pressed close to Mitchell, overwhelmed by sensory overload that made Frankfurt seem quiet by comparison. They had a 5-hour wait before their train to Chicago, and Mitchell used the time to show Hans some of New York. They walked through Times Square, where Hans stared at the massive advertisements and neon signs with undisguised amazement. They stopped at an automat, where Hans was fascinated by the concept of food dispensed from Cro-Man glass machines. Mitchell bought him a piece of apple pie, and Hans ate it slowly, savoring every bite with the careful appreciation of someone who had known hunger. "Everything is so big here," Hans observed, watching crowds flow past. "So many people, so much, everything. Iowa will be quieter," Mitchell promised. "More like what you're used to, just without the war damage. Open fields, small towns, people who know their neighbors." The train journey from New York to Chicago took overnight, and then another train from Chicago to Cedar Rapids. Hans slept fitfully, waking periodically to find himself still moving, still surrounded by the alien landscape of America rushing past in darkness. Mitchell dozed across from him, one eye always half open with the alertness learned through years of military service. They reached Cedar Rapids on December 4th, 1945, in late afternoon. The train pulled into a station decorated with Christmas wreaths and garlands, and Mitchell felt his heart accelerate as he scanned the platform. Then he saw the Eleanor in her blue coat with Sarah beside her, holding her mother's hand and hopping with barely contained excitement. Mitchell descended first, dropping his bag to embrace his wife and daughter. Hans hung back, suddenly terrified. This was the moment that would determine everything: acceptance or rejection, home or continued displacement. He stood on the train steps, his small suitcase clutched in both hands, watching this reunion of strangers who were supposed to become his family. Eleanor noticed him first. She released Robert and walked toward the train, her expression impossible to read. Hans felt his breathing quicken, old instincts preparing for disappointment or worse. Then Eleanor smiled, a genuine warmth that transformed her face, and extended her hand. "Hello, Hans," she said clearly, using the English pronunciation Robert had coached her on. "Welcome home." Hans descended the steps on trembling legs and shook her hand formally, the German propriety drilled into him by years of strict upbringing. "Thank you, Mrs. Mitchell. I am." I am happy to be here. Sarah stepped forward, regarding Hans with open curiosity. At 8 years old, she was small for her age but carried herself with confidence. Are you really going to be my brother? She asked bluntly, with the directness of children. Yes, if you want, Hans replied carefully. Sarah considered this for a moment. Okay, but I get to show you my room first, and you have to meet Buddy, and Mom says you have to learn our rules. And Sarah. Breathe, Eleanor interrupted, gently laughing. She looked at Robert with an expression that mixed relief, apprehension, and determination. Let's go home. The first weeks in Cedar Rapids were harder than anyone had anticipated. The Mitchell home was a modest 2-story house on 3rd Avenue, with white clapboard siding and a front porch that overlooked a street lined with elm trees. To Hans, accustomed to the stone architecture of Bavaria and the ruins of wartime Germany, everything seemed impossibly clean and whole houses with intact roofs, windows with unbroken glass, streets without rubble or craters. Eleanor had prepared the spare room on the 2nd floor next to Sarah's bedroom. It wasn't large, barely enough space for a single bed, a small dresser, and a desk, but she had made it welcoming with quilts her grandmother had sewn and curtains in cheerful yellow. Hans stood in the doorway that first evening, unable to comprehend that this space was his, that he wouldn't have to share it with a dozen other displaced people, or sleep with one eye open against danger. Do you like it? Eleanor asked, watching his face for reactions. She had spent days preparing this room, agonizing over details, trying to imagine what a traumatized boy might need. It is ... it is too much, Hans said quietly. I do not deserve... Stop. Eleanor's voice was firm but not harsh. You deserve safety and comfort and love, Hans. That's not negotiable. This is your room, your home. You don't have to earn it. The concept was foreign to Hans, who had spent the past year in a transactional world where everything came at a cost. He nodded without fully believing, but placed his suitcase on the bed with reverence. That night, he lay awake for hours, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of an American household, the creak of floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, Sarah's soft snoring through the thin walls, and wondered if this fragile peace could possibly last. School presented the first major challenge. Eleanor enrolled Hans at McKinley Elementary, where Sarah attended 4th grade. The principal, Mr. Horace Whitman, was a veteran of the First World War, who had lost an arm at Belleau Wood. He regarded Hans with complex, feeling sympathy for a child caught in war mixed with residual hostility toward anything German. His English is good enough for basic communication, Principal Whitman assessed after a brief interview, but he'll need significant help to keep pace academically. We can start him in 5th grade provisionally, but if he struggles, we may need to hold him back. Hans started classes on December 10th, 1945, and immediately became an object of intense curiosity. The other students had heard about the German boy the Mitchells had brought home. Cedar Rapids was small enough that news traveled fast, and they surrounded him during recess with questions that ranged from innocent to cruel. Did you see Hitler? One boy asked. Can you speak German? Say something in German? Demanded another. My uncle died fighting your people, said Tommy Brennan, 6th grader with red hair and freckles, his voice carrying accusation rather than curiosity. Why should we let you come here? Hans had no answer to that question. He stood in the crowded playground, surrounded by children who saw him as both fascinating and suspect, and felt the old panic rising. He looked toward the school building where Sarah was playing with her friends, hoping for rescue, but she was too far away to notice his distress. The situation was diffused by an unexpected ally. Marcus Washington, one of only 3 black students at McKinley Elementary, walked over and stood beside Hans. Marcus was 13, held back twice due to the inadequate segregated schooling he had received before his family moved north from Alabama, and he recognized persecution when he saw it. Leave him alone, Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying more authority than his age suggested. He's lost, and ganging up on him makes you all look small. Tommy Brennan sneered. Why do you care, Marcus? He ain't your people. Neither are you, Marcus replied evenly. But I know what it's like to be the one everyone stares at. Come on, Hans, I'll show you where the decent kids hang out. That intervention marked the beginning of an unlikely friendship. Marcus took Hans under his wing, teaching him the unwritten rules of American school, social dynamics, and defending him when necessary. They were an odd pair, the displaced German boy and the black student from the South, but their shared experience of otherness created a bond that transcended their differences. According to sociological studies documented in Children of World War II by historian William Tuttle, displaced European children in American schools during the immediate post-war period often faced significant integration challenges, including language barriers, cultural misunderstandings, and hostility from classmates whose families had lost members in the war. Success rates varied dramatically based on individual circumstances and community receptiveness. At home, the dynamics were equally complex. Sarah's initial enthusiasm waned as she realized Hans's presence meant sharing her parents' attention. She began acting out small rebellions like refusing to set the table or dramatically sighing when asked to include Hans in her activities. Eleanor recognized classic sibling rivalry complicated by unusual circumstances. But knowing the cause didn't immediately suggest solutions. The breaking point came 2 weeks after Hans's arrival. Tara had been working on a school art project, a watercolor painting of a robin, and left it drying on the kitchen table. Hans, trying to be helpful, had cleared the table for dinner and accidentally smudged the painting. Sarah's reaction was explosive, screaming that Hans had ruined everything and she wished he had never come to America. Hans fled to his room, and Eleanor found him an hour later sitting on his bed, his few possessions packed back in his suitcase. "I will go," he said dully when Eleanor entered. "I'll make problems. Sarah's right. Should not be here." Eleanor sat beside him on the bed, her heart breaking for both children. "Hans, look at me." She waited until his reluctant eyes met hers. "Sarah is angry about a painting, not about you. She's 8 years old and adjusting to a big change. Don't get to leave every time something is difficult. Family means staying even when it's hard." "But I am not really family," Hans said, voicing the fear that had haunted him since New York. I am just someone Sergeant Mitchell felt sorry for." Eleanor took his hands in hers, feeling how cold they were despite the warm house. "Robert doesn't do things out of pity. He brought you home because he saw something in you worth saving, worth loving. And I'm starting to see it too, a kind, thoughtful boy who tries so hard to be good that he forgets he's allowed to just be a child sometimes." She pulled him into an embrace, and after a moment, Hans relaxed against her, allowing himself the comfort he had been too afraid to accept. That evening, Eleanor facilitated a conversation between Hans and Sarah, mediating as they stumbled toward understanding. Sarah apologized for her outburst, Hans apologized for the painting, and they reached the tentative truce of children learning to share space and parents. "Can I teach you English words?" Sarah asked later, testing the boundaries of their new relationship. "Some of the ones you say sound funny." "Yes," Hans agreed, "and maybe I teach you some German, so you can know where I am from." Sarah considered this. "Okay, but just the good words." Nothing about the war," Hans agreed softly. Robert Mitchell watched these interactions from the periphery, marveling at his family's capacity for growth. He had returned from war changed harder in some ways, softer in others, and he saw similar transformations happening in Eleanor and Sarah. They were becoming something different from what they had been, shaped by the choice to open their home to a child from an enemy nation. Whether that transformation would ultimately strengthen or strain them remained to be seen, but Mitchell felt certain it was necessary, meaningful work. January 1946 brought the beginning of formal adoption proceedings, and with them, unexpected complications. Robert and Eleanor Mitchell met with attorney George Hartley, a Cedar Rapids lawyer specializing in family law who had agreed to take their case. Hartley was in his 50s, a man who had served in the First World War and brought that experience to his understanding of Hans's situation. "I'll be frank with you," Hartley said during their initial consultation, spreading documents across his desk. "What you're attempting is legally unprecedented in Iowa. We've had families adopt war orphans from friendly nations, Britain, France, but a German national. The statutes are unclear at best, potentially prohibitive at worst. What are our chances?" Eleanor asked, her hand finding Robert's beneath the table. Hartley adjusted his glasses, studying the paperwork Hans had brought from Germany. 50-50 maybe. "We'll need to convince a judge that Hans meets the criteria for orphan status, that you're suitable adoptive parents, which shouldn't be difficult, and that the adoption serves the child's best interests. The wild card is public opinion. Iowa lost over 8,000 men in this war. Many families will see adopting a German boy as a betrayal. That prediction proved accurate. News of the Mitchells' adoption petition spread through Cedar Rapids, generating responses ranging from supportive to hostile. The Cedar Rapids Gazette ran a story on January 15th titled, "Local Family Seeks to Adopt German War Orphan Community Divided." The article featured interviews with residents expressing wildly different views. It's Christian charity, said Reverend Thompson of First Methodist Church. The boy is innocent of his nation's crimes. Punishing him accomplishes nothing except perpetuating hatred. "Sarah, do you want Hans to be your brother?" Judge Cooper asked gently. Sarah considered the question with a seriousness beyond her years. "At first I didn't know. I was mad that he was getting so much attention. Then I saw him crying one night because he had a nightmare about his mom, and I realized he's not taking anything from me. He's just sad and lost, and he needs us. So yes, I want him to be my brother. We're teaching each other stuff. And he's funny sometimes, and he helps me with my math homework last week, even though American math is different from German math." "Thank you, Sarah. You can step down." Judge Cooper reviewed documents in silence for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. The courtroom held its collective breath. Finally, the judge looked up, his expression unreadable. "This court has weighed the arguments carefully. The legal questions are complex, but they are ultimately secondary to a simpler question. What serves this child's best interests?" Hans Weber is 12 years old. He has no living relatives. He has been under the Mitchells' care for 9 months, and has, by all accounts, thrived in their home. He excels in school, has formed positive relationships, and shows no behavioral concerns. Some in this community argue that adopting a German child dishonors the memory of those who died fighting Germany. I respectfully disagree. The men who died fought for freedom, democracy, and human dignity. Denying those things to Hans would betray their sacrifice, not honor it. The petition for adoption is granted. Hans Friedrich Weber is hereby legally adopted by Robert James Mitchell and Eleanor Marie Mitchell, with all rights and responsibilities pertaining thereto. His name is officially changed to Hans Weber Mitchell. This court further orders that his adoption records be sealed and that he be granted all the protections and privileges of any natural-born citizen. The gavel fell, and for a moment, silence hung in the courtroom. Then Eleanor burst into tears, pulling Hans into an embrace while Robert wrapped his arms around both of them. Sarah joined the huddle, and they stood together, a family now legally recognized as well as spiritually forged. Reverend Thompson started applauding, joined quickly by their supporters. Not everyone clapped. Harold Brennan and his allies sat stone-faced, but the sound filled the courtroom with unexpected joy. Even Judge Cooper smiled slightly, a rare expression for the stern jurist. Outside the courthouse, reporters from the Cedar Rapids Gazette and the Des Moines Register wanted interviews. Robert gave a brief statement thanking the judge and expressing hope that Cedar Rapids would welcome Hans as a full member of the community. Hans stood beside him, still processing what had happened, trying to grasp that the uncertainty was finally over. Tommy Brennan approached as the crowd dispersed, his father nowhere in sight. "I guess congratulations," Tommy said awkwardly to Hans. "You're an American now." "Thank you," Hans replied, equally uncertain. "My dad is still pretty mad," Tommy continued, "but I told him you're okay. For a German, it wasn't exactly friendship, but it was a stark acknowledgement that Hans was becoming a person rather than remaining a symbol." The years that followed were not without challenges. Hans carried trauma that surfaced in unexpected ways. Certain sounds triggered flashbacks. Anniversary dates brought depression. Guilt about survival, when so many had died, haunted him into adulthood. But the Mitchell family provided stability, love, and the space to heal at his own pace. Hans excelled academically, eventually attending the University of Iowa on scholarship. He majored in engineering, driven partly by America's post-war technological optimism and partly by a desire to build rather than destroy. Graduated in 1954, married a Cedar Rapids girl named Linda Thompson in 1956, and had 3 children who grew up knowing they had a grandfather who had been a German soldier and a grandmother who had welcomed an enemy child into her home. Robert Mitchell never spoke much about the war, as was common for his generation, but he kept a photograph on his desk Hans on the day of his adoption, smiling tentatively at the camera. flanked by Robert and Eleanor with Sarah in front. Visitors who asked about it received a simple answer: "That's my son." The story of Hans Weber Mitchell became part of Cedar Rapids lore, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy. Some portrayed it as heartwarming evidence of American generosity. Others saw it as controversial even decades later. But for those actually involved, it was simply the story of how a German boy soldier found a father in an American sergeant, and how that unlikely connection created a family that proved love could transcend even the deepest divisions of war. Hans lived until 2015, dying at age 82, surrounded by children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, who carried within them the genetic heritage of both Germany and America, living proof that the future need not be imprisoned by the past. His obituary in the Cedar Rapids Gazette mentioned his distinguished career as an engineer, his service on the local school board, and his tireless advocacy for refugee children, a lifetime spent paying forward the mercy he had been shown on that April day in 1945, when an Iowa sergeant chose humanity over hatred. In the end, the story of Hans and Robert Mitchell was not about nations or armies or the grand sweep of history. It was about the moment when one man looked at an enemy child and saw a son, and the ripples that single act of compassion sent forward through time, proving that even in the darkest hours, individuals retain the power to choose light over darkness, mercy over vengeance, hope over despair.